I think it's a very exciting time for our department. Our faculty have really been at the cutting edge of developing and implementing the sort of best practices around education reform. Our faculty have been involved in developing the state-of-the-art assessment models that are being employed all over the country and elsewhere around the world that allow us to track individual student success. We have this really interesting, compelling track record of doing cutting-edge research and scholarship. What's exciting at the moment is trying to bring that deep, very involved and impactful scholarship into sort of a coherent model of how our department works. And to think about the sort of bridging research and practice theme that has been at the center of what our faculty do, and make that the centerpiece of how the department works. The introduction of our new concentration areas in our doctorate in education program is an example of trying to unite that synergy of scholarship to the core curriculum of EMPL. So it's a very exciting time around the sort of recentering the identity of the department to bring that research to practice focus into much greater and much more into the center of what we do. I think sometimes we find ourselves in leadership by somewhat random circumstances. On the other hand, I also think that there are certain conditions that align with the knowledge you bring, with the way that you approach your work, that make sort of leadership happen at the time that it happens. I think for me, it's characteristic of the roles that I played at the University of Oregon. There's sort of been moments where what you bring is particularly useful, and I think that's been true in all the various roles that I've had at the university. As a teacher, as a mentor to students, certainly my leadership roles as vice president and now as department head in EMPL, it's sort of the circumstances of being able to have a skill set that at that moment in time is particularly helpful. And if I look at it more globally, I think across those skill sets, the most important of those is probably the listening, really trying to understand the way people think about the organizations, to try to put people in positions to shine. I think that's has been one of my big goals as a leader, and certainly at the university level or here at the department level, whether we're talking about our students or our faculty or our staff, doing things as a leader that doesn't get in their way in terms of doing the things that they can do. Our research at the Center for Equity Promotion is really oriented towards trying to understand the factors involved in promoting success and the things that get in the way of success for students and children and families in the most vulnerable communities. So we spend a lot of time looking at the disparities in education and behavioral health that dominate outcomes right now for students of color, for students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, for first-generation students, for students whose first language is not English, and understanding those links, but then also developing really targeted interventions that are about promoting success for those individuals. So all of our work has that same flavor, whether we're doing basic longitudinal studies or whether we're doing applied intervention development or implementation work. Right now, we're one of the cornerstones, I think, of all of the projects that we're involved in has to do with a model of community empowerment. We spend a lot of time really paying attention to what communities need and letting those needs really drive the development of effective practices and interventions. So we have projects that that are designed to address the issues of educational equity and violence prevention in countries throughout Central America. We're working in Honduras and Nicaragua and Guatemala, El Salvador, and now we're beginning to work in other countries also in Latin America. And those are really, again, about sort of bringing forth from the community practices that are already working, but adding to those practices from the evidence base of programs that are developed in the U.S. and elsewhere, but then contextualizing and adapting those interventions so that they have a high level of cultural relevancy. So that work exists internationally, and at the same time we're working extensively in communities throughout Oregon and elsewhere in the U.S., developing interventions from a community-based model. As a clinical psychologist, I think the critical thing that background and training brings to this perspective that I hold is about sort of positioning the person within context in a very particular way. So as a psychologist, I tend to pay a lot of attention to the social contextual circumstances that really drive outcomes for students in schools. And that means that the targets of intervention, when I think about the applied work I do as a clinician, broaden beyond the focus on an individual student, but instead the sort of student in a deeper relationship context. So for example, we spend a lot of our intervention effort focused on family engagement and involvement. So when students have challenges, we think about the role that families play in helping to promote the success for students. And then we think about the system level challenges and how systems operate in perpetuating injustice and inequities, but also in promoting better outcomes. I think the other factor is thinking developmentally, and I think that's a nature of being a psychologist. I'm really interested in the sort of pathways that lead from one thing to another during the life course that can lead to success, or in some cases higher probability of challenge in the education systems. So we tend to focus a lot on sort of what's that developmental pathway and how are the outcomes related to each other. So, school success is only one of the outcomes that we focus on, certainly in the work that I do. So we think about the interconnection between school success and failure, but with peer relationships, with mental health and behavioral health, with family functioning and dynamics, with early bonding. So we think about outcomes as being interrelated with one another. And I think that's a unique characteristic of my training as a psychologist. Well, I think in any area of research and practice, thinking past the local context is always going to inform advancing practices in schools. Schools and educational policies can get relatively insular, and how do we understand the sort of socio-historical foundations of education in the U.S. if we can't have a broader international perspective that allows us a basis of comparisons about the way in which that system has developed vis-a-vis other approaches to educational systems? We need that. Our leaders in the United States need to better understand the context of education from a global perspective. And we bring to that global perspective and to researchers and practitioners all over the world a unique set of circumstances about how the U.S. education system works that can also help advance those systems. So that international perspective is really essential in driving the next generation of effective practices. The other big part of that is that the world is getting much smaller because of the use of technology, because of the sort of instant access to information. Our students in the United States, in places like Oregon, and local districts, need to be able to respond to a much more complicated and pluralistic global world. And that drive is essential for the success of students in this country and all over the world.